Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. Today, Brandon DaCruz is back for the second part of his interview on fat loss. Today, we discuss the physiology of fat loss, aka how your body actually burns fat when you create a caloric deficit, which is a much more complex process than the oversimplified statement, "it's just a calorie deficit," would lead you to believe. Then we cover 5 of what Brandon calls high priority principles that you can use in order to devise your own personalized strategy for a successful fat loss phase. Without further ado, let's get straight into this episode. Hey, Brandon, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here with you, my friend. I appreciate you making time in your schedule to do this late night. I see you with the blue blockers on. You're almost ready for bed, but we're still going to get this in for your audience. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to doing part 2.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just grateful that you wanted to be back on to discuss, once again, fat loss. In the first interview that I had with you, we talked about how to prime yourself for fat loss, and we discussed that in depth. So if, dear listeners, you want to know who Brandon is and find out more about the best strategies to prime yourself for a successful fat loss phase, go back to episode number 18. And today, instead, I'd like to start with a little bit of a physiology conversation about physiology-related conversation about fat loss, because I feel like most people at this point, at least in our area of the fitness industry, understand how to achieve fat loss, which is most often you will hear people say, oh yeah, it's just quote unquote a calorie deficit. But I think a lot of people don't actually know what happens when you create this deficit and how the body actually burns body fat. So if you could go into that to start with, that'd be great.
Yeah, without a doubt. It's funny that you say that. I often say that there's a lot of statements within this industry that they're truthful, but they aren't useful and they aren't explanatory. So a lot of times you'll see, whether it be on social media or you see other coaches promoting, and all they say is, you want to lose fat, just create a deficit, eat less, exercise more. And it's these simple statements. It's really easy to get across to an audience or put on an infographic, but it really doesn't explain the underlying mechanisms. And I'm really big into empowering both my clients and then those that I engage with education. So this is where, I'm really big into the physiology of things. But when we look at it from a broad-based perspective, we know that when we go into a calorie, or when we go into a fat loss phase and create a calorie deficit, the goal is for our calorie expenditure to consistently exceed our calorie intake to induce a state of negative energy balance. And when we consistently maintain a calorie deficit, we're essentially consuming less energy than we're burning. So our body has to resort to using stored forms of energy to fuel our activities of both daily living and our exercise habits. So seeing as fat is the largest storage site for energy in the body, we want to bias using body fat to provide us with the energy we need to complete our daily tasks and activities. But in order to lose weight and fat, we need to not only induce this consistent calorie deficit, but we need to specifically know how we burn body fat. And that actually takes a 3-part process, which a lot of people overlook. And that's where we're really going into the physiology of things. So really, when we look at the process of burning body fat, which is what many people's goals are, when we look, a lot of people talk about weight loss, but really what they're aiming for is fat loss. They want to maintain their muscle tissue and they want to exclusively lose fat mass off their body to improve the aesthetic or the look of their physique, their metabolic health. There really are no benefits from losing muscle mass. So really, we're looking for quality weight loss. And that's why, individuals like myself and you, we focus on fat loss, and that's why we don't speak about just like weight loss phases. We're talking specifically fat loss phases. But in order to be able to burn body fat in and of itself, there's a three-part process, and it's lipolysis, it's transport, and it's oxidation. So, when it comes down to burning body fat, the first step is to go through lipolysis, which is the mobilization of fatty acids. So essentially what we need to do is we need to not only, it's not like we just go into a deficit, we automatically lose fat, like it just falls off our body. Essentially, we need to liberate free fatty acids from the fat cells itself and then liberate those into the bloodstream to be burned off as energy. So that's the first part of the process, because without that, we cannot effectively have fats floating in the bloodstream to even be oxidized or utilized. And so the second part of the fat burning process is what's called transport or transportation. So once we've mobilized free fatty acids from our actual fat tissue into the bloodstream, these fatty acids need to be transported to a site where they can be burned off for energy. So that could be, say, a muscle cell or a liver cell. Wherever a target tissue needs energy, that's where free fatty acids will be transported, because that is the energy substrate that we're utilizing. And fatty acid transport is heavily dependent on blood flow in that area, because sufficient blood flow is needed so that we can actually transport those free fatty acids to that target tissue. Because think about it, you could have, I always give this example, but you could have fat on your ass, but you might not be utilizing it in your ass. You know what I mean? You might be utilizing it in your delts or in another target tissue. You're doing, say bicep curls, and you're trying to transport that into a different area. So if there isn't sufficient blood flow, and this is important because if there isn't sufficient blood flow, those free fatty acids can be mobilized. So, for instance, you could utilize a product like caffeine, which is going to increase the catecholamines in the blood. That's going to increase the process of lipolysis, that first step. It'll liberate free fatty acids in the blood. But say you just stay seated. You take, a coffee or a fat burner, you stay seated, you don't go through any activity. Well, not only has blood flow been limited because you're not moving around, you're not increasing blood flow, but also there's no stimulus for oxidation or the burning of that body fat. So what will end up happening is you liberated those fatty acids, but they didn't get transported, nor did they get burned. So what ends up happening is they get restored back into fat cells, so they won't be burned off. So that's why this is a three-step process, because it's not just enough to just liberate fat or to transport it. It also needs to be oxidized, which is that third and final process, which is essentially the burning. So once fatty acids have been, they've went through the process, they've been mobilized and transported to that target tissue or cell where that energy is needed, they will need to be transported into the mitochondria of that cell to be used for energy. And that's where something like aerobic training or even our resistance training comes into play, because we need to be doing some type of activity. And it can even be as simple or as low intensity as going for a walk. Like, you've liberated fatty acids, you've mobilized them, you've transported them into the site, it could be to your legs, and now you're going to utilize them for oxidation or for the burning of that fat. So in order for fat to be burned, we need to go through these three steps. Now, once we burn these fatty acids for energy, we lose the fat itself by breathing it out as CO2, so carbon dioxide. As fat molecularly, if you look at it, like if you look at a chain of, if you look at fat from a molecular standpoint, it's just a long chain of carbon. So essentially, what we're doing is we're breathing out fat that has been burned. So although most of the time, like we were speaking about previously, most people online will say all you need to do to lose weight is to eat in a deficit. It's a bit more complicated of a process from a physiological perspective.
Fantastic explanation. Thank you very much. So, just to recap for everyone, there's a three-part process to burning body fat. We've got lipolysis, which is the liberation of free fatty acids from fat cells into the bloodstream. Then we've got transport of these free fatty acids to a site where they will be burnt off for energy. And finally, we've got oxidation, which is the actual burning of body fat. And I really like that you went in depth explaining all of these concepts, because that explanation, I feel, leads really well into my next question, which is going to be, so now that we know how to create, well, we know what happens when we create a caloric deficit, then which tools can we use to create a caloric deficit that, as you say, achieves quality weight loss? I really like that term, where we primarily burn body fat and we maintain, ideally, most, if not all, of the muscle mass that we have.
Absolutely. So, from a broad based perspective, as a coach, I've worked with clients from all different backgrounds, starting points, body composition goals, and preferences. So although many will minimize like the process like we were speaking about of fat loss just to creating a deficit, I think really when we talk about it from a coaching perspective, that's not really helpful. And so really when I look at it from a coaching perspective, it's important to realize that coaching is not just about cutting calories. Even if the goal is fat loss, it's about considering the individual context of the specific client we're working with and using the right tool for the right job for the right person. So before, before creating a diet or putting a client into a deficit or into a cut, I always account for their dieting history, their nutritional knowledge, and like their nutritional literacy, where they're starting at from like a body fat and a body composition perspective, as well as like what's their goal? Like how much fat are they looking to lose? And is that reasonable? Is that an achievable goal? I'm looking at their needs, their preferences, their ability, their relationship with food, and then also their schedule and their lifestyle, because the interventions or the tools that we utilize are going to have to be very specific. So the approach that I use to get a client to their fat loss goal is going to be completely dependent on the individual client I'm working with. However, when it comes down to speaking on a podcast, we got to speak in generalities. So I'm going to cover a few of like what I call my high priority principles that I use with many of my clients, as I've seen that these strategies or these methods have been really helpful for the majority of individuals that I've used them with, during their fat loss phases. And so these are things that are more applicable to a broad-based audience. And yes, there might be some deviations, but these are principles, not methods. So principles are few, methods are many. There are many roads to the same destination, and you need to manipulate them and customize them towards your client. Or if you're listening to this and you're going into a fat loss phase, you need to individualize it to yourself. However, there are some what I call high priority principles, but in general, principles that can help lead people to being more successful in their pursuit of fat loss. So the first thing that I'm looking to do, like my first high priority principle when I'm starting a client out in a fat loss phase, is I always take a food first approach. And the reason for that is because a lot of times we have different camps within this industry where they focus on one end of the spectrum or the other. And so if it's fat loss, some people really want to focus on the exercise portion. But really, to sustainably create a deficit, we really need to look at things from a nutritional perspective. Because say you wanted to induce a 500 calorie deficit, just using a generic, deficit that's thrown out there a lot. It's really much more difficult to accurately and consistently create a 500 calorie deficit purely from exercise than it is from nutrition. So I really want to focus food first. And really, what I'm trying to do is my approach focuses on creating a calorie deficit, not a nutrient deficit, which is done through improving diet quality and maintaining a high level of diet quality, because that's what's going to ensure that we not only get to the calorie intake that we need, but that we also make sure that they have all the micronutrients that they need. But prior to doing this, I think it's important, to at least acknowledge the fact that before we start a fat loss diet, we first need to find, the client's maintenance intake, because that's we need a starting point. So this could be done through a few ways, but my preferred method depends on the experience level of the client that I'm working with. So I have a broad, spectrum of clients that I work with. I get a lot of advanced trainees, and so with them, they have a vast experience with macro tracking, with calorie tracking, with fat loss phases in the past. But if I have an advanced trainee come to me who I've never went through a fat loss phase with, what I'll usually have them do is I'll have them do a food diary. And I'll also have them take their daily, their scale weight daily. So I can find their maintenance intake from those two. So I'm really trying to correlate those two metrics with one another to see what keeps their body weight stable or what keeps them in energy balance. However, what I often do with clients who I work with, I've never done a fat loss phase with. So I've brought them through, say go through the primer phase. What I'll do is I'll take a 1 to 2 week period of time where I'll set a baseline diet for them based on, what I predict their actual maintenance intake to be at based on the data that I've collected on them throughout the time, the process or the time period that we've been working together. And then what I'll have them do is I'll also have them weigh themselves daily while following this baseline diet. So then I can have an average, daily weigh-in across the week. And from that, I'll calculate their actual maintenance, their true maintenance by looking at their trends in weight over those 1 to 2 weeks. From there, that's when I'm going to create the deficit. And it's the deficit really is going to be, I never use like these generic, like you'll hear people throw out, utilize a 25% calorie deficit or a 30% calorie deficit or a 500 calorie reduction. off the bat. I really think it needs to be specified to the individual, their goals, their starting place. We also have to think about, sex differences. So if I was to utilize a 500 calorie deficit with a male that has a maintenance calorie intake of 3,500 calories, that's not that much. He's still eating 3,000 calories. However, if I have a female come to me and her baseline intake, her maintenance is truly 1,500, then I put her in a 500 calorie deficit. That's drastically low. And so we really have to individualize it. So the approach that I like to take is I will generally do it based off a range of a target body weight range. So with that, I'm looking to target a weekly loss of 0.5 to 1% weight loss per week. And so then the deficit will be created based off of what that equates to based off their body weight and based off their calorie intake. And so it's a little bit more customized and individualized to that specific client so that it's not this generic, like templated approach where everyone gets the same calorie deficit. Everyone cuts off 25% off their calories. And we see in the research a lot, you'll see 25% or 30%. And so a lot of people will utilize that approach. However, what a lot of people also don't realize is everything in research needs to be standardized. So research doesn't tell us exactly what to do. Often it tells us what not to do. However, a lot of times, like I've had in-depth discussions with Eric Helms, with Dr. Bill Campbell, and these are standardization or standardized protocols that need to be because they need to be able to extract exactly the responses everyone had to the same diet protocol. So the same protein intake, the same macronutrient distribution, the same calorie deficit, and then look at means or averages in the group, but that doesn't extrapolate to everyone. The average is just the mean, the middle of the road, but there are outliers in both directions. So there's people that are unresponsive or they're we have hyper responders, and then we have what some people would consider like non-responders, which are really like low responders. And we see that in any type of physiology that we look at, whether it be resistance training, cardiovascular training, or dietary interventions. But a mistake I see a lot of other dieters and coaches make is that they focus so much on weight loss and just on the quantity of calories they're taking in, rather than realizing that in order to improve our body composition, we need to not only decrease our body fat mass, but we also need to maintain our muscle tissue. So, really, in order to do this and accomplish this goal, we need to not only create a calorie deficit, but we also need to optimize both the macronutrient composition and the food quality aspect of our diets. So, my goal when I'm setting up a client's fat loss diet is to make sure that I created an effective deficit. Like that's necessary. Calories are, energy balance is going to be the main fundamental principle, but we need to look beyond that. So, I want to create an effective calorie deficit that they can maintain because that's a big thing too. We have to look at adherence and sustainability, but I also want to construct a reduced calorie diet that doesn't induce a nutrient deficit, which is what so many of the trendy like fad diets that we see out there do. So what I'm aiming to do is to make sure that they're having high quality nutrient dense foods to ensure they're getting all of the micronutrients, so all of the vitamins and minerals, all the polyphenols, adequate fiber intake. They need to not only maintain their muscle tissue, but to feel good both in and out of the gym, to maintain proper hormone production, and then optimal health. Because really, what I found within coaching is giving people a calorie prescription is not enough. Really, what we need to look to do is I always say this statement, but my goal is, or with my experience, I've seen that a healthy body is a responsive body. So if we only focus on the calories, we only focus on that weight loss aspect, we lose sight of a lot of the other goals that should be ticked off from both a nutrition and from a body composition perspective. So I make sure that they're able to, I make sure that they have a calorie deficit. We have all their micronutrients dialed in. Their macronutrient composition is dialed in as well. And really what I'm looking to do is to make sure that they're able to not only have that, properly placed and properly periodized, but they're also able to adhere to the diet and maintain that deficit through other high priority principles. So, for instance, there's a couple other things that I'll utilize with the vast majority of my clients, and these are things that I would suggest everyone out there utilize. So, one principle would be leveraging the energy density of the diet. Another would be increasing protein intake or maintaining a high protein intake. Another principle would be maintaining adequate fiber intake. So these are all things nutritionally that will really help someone um, be successful in their attempt to not only lose weight, but lose body fat and maintain muscle tissue while also feeling good and being able to adhere to the diet because there's so many other principles beyond just create a deficit or eat less, exercise more. So the next principle, as I had hit on, was after creating a deficit, I aim to manage a client's calorie budget via energy density. So we know that if you really look at like what people struggle with in a diet, generally we see the effects from a physiological perspective, but also from a psychological perspective. And a lot of those center around increasing hunger. And that's often like the biggest bottleneck in people's journey. Like people struggle to stay and stick to a deficit and stay compliant during a fat loss phase, not because they don't want the goals. It's because they struggle oftentimes with lack of energy and heightened hunger. And it's usually hunger wins the battle. It's like the biggest bottleneck in people's journeys. That's if you ever like interact, and I've interacted with hundreds at this point, people that come to me that have went through chronic dieting cycles, have went through multiple diets within the past year and throughout the course of their lives. And often I ask, well, what were the issues you faced? Or what were the things that held you back? Or what caused you to regain weight very quickly after finishing the diet? And 9 out of 10 times, it's hunger and appetite. I succumbed to cravings. I was experiencing ravishing hunger. A lot of times when I have people that come to me with like if it fits your macros types diets, it was really hard to moderate their intake of the portion sizes of those foods while getting into a deficit, and especially when like the reins were taken off and they went out when they finished their fat loss phase. So leveraging the energy density of the diet as a principle, I found to be extremely effective, especially as my goal is to maximize the amount of fullness and satiety I can provide clients within their target calorie budget. And so I'm really looking to keep them within the constraints of the calories and macros we have set, but I'm able to induce greater feelings of fullness and satiety, which increase their adherence by including more, say, low energy density foods into the diet. So when we look at energy density, for anyone that's not familiar with that, it essentially just refers to the amount of calories contained in a given weight of food. So it really breaks down to how many calories are contained per 1 gram of a food source. But what we have to realize is that not all, often people say calories are created equal. All right, from an energy perspective, they are, but not all food sources are created equal, especially when it comes down to the energy density of those foods, because two foods can have the same food weight or two foods can have the same calorie amount, but vastly different food weights. So that's where we look at energy density. You could have 100 grams of strawberries compared to 100 grams of peanut butter, and they're going to have vastly different calorie amounts. Or we could take the opposite. We'll do the inverse: 100 calories from strawberries, and you'll have 2 cups, or you'll have 100 calories from peanut butter, and you'll have 1 tablespoon. And these are vastly different amounts of actual food volume and food weight and induce much different levels of satiety. So I especially like to leverage or modify the energy density of the foods I use on a diet so that as a client gets deeper into a fat loss diet and they experience more hunger, that's a natural physiological response. That's part of metabolic adaptation. You're going to see increases in hunger. You're also, from a hormonal perspective, going to see decreases in our hunger suppressing hormone, leptin, and increases in our hunger increasing hormone, ghrelin. And so both from a physiological and from a psychological perspective, you feel hungrier and you're experiencing it internally as well. So, really, what I try to do is as they get deeper into that fat loss diet, they're experiencing more of these inherent drawbacks of dieting. I want them consuming more low energy density, high volume foods that provide a ton of satiety per calorie, and they're more filling and help to manage their hunger better, which makes adherence much easier for them. Because fat loss dieting is going to be difficult, it's going to be a challenge. But if we could better manage their hunger, better manage their appetite, and also help them have interventions in place where they could stay more consistent, more adherent, they're not only going to be more successful, but they're going to suffer less in the process. And that's a big thing, both from a physiological perspective, but also from a psychological perspective. A lot of people have poor relationships with food or directly with dieting for fat loss because of the experiences that they faced in the past, the bad experiences where they've had negative, implications, or they've had experiences where they felt so hungry that they felt out of control or they binge ate. And these are all things that as a coach, we see in practice, but also we can utilize strategies or these principles to help mitigate that. And that's really my goal. So throughout the course of a fat loss phase, I'll employ adjustments like, say, like transitioning their protein sources. So I might start a fat loss phase off with fattier sources of proteins. And then throughout the course of that fat loss phase, as we need to induce a greater energy deficit, I'll start transitioning them to lower calorie, leaner protein sources. And then also within that, as they have to eat less, keep in mind, we're eating less calories. That doesn't mean we have to eat less volume of food. And so one way that we can induce greater satiety is that we could take some of our more energy dense or more calorie containing foods and swap them out for lower energy density food sources like vegetables, like fruits, like whole grains, which are going to provide greater fullness for less calories as compared to those higher energy food sources that we initially had in the diet. So basically, by making these adjustments, we're able to get more bang for our buck in terms of the amount of fullness we have for the amount of calories we're taking in. And this is really advantageous because you're going to have to eat less throughout the course of the diet, but eating less is often looked at as a portion control thing. And we actually see in research, like independent research, looking at when it's just portion control and they just take the same foods that individuals have used in dietary interventions and just cut them down to induce a deficit, that often they have a high recidivism rate. Either they fall off the diet, they drop out of the study, or they're unable to sustain post diet the results that they got during the diet. And so, what we want to do is not just limit portion sizes. If you're having like energy dense foods, yes, we might have to moderate the portion sizes, but I want people eating more in terms of food volume and food satiety, but eating less in terms of calories. And we have to realize that one are not in the same. So it's not that food volume and calories are equal with one another. And so that as we lower calories, we have to eat less food weight because that is going to only increase hunger all the more. So, we really want to be able to maximize that energy density aspect of the diet. Now, from there, another huge, one of my biggest key principles is keeping protein intake high. And so, for a lot of like resistance training individuals, they're already utilizing high protein, but I have a lot of people that come to me that one of the biggest bottlenecks within their body composition or their nutritional approach is that they don't eat enough protein. Like they undereat protein, especially at breakfast. They're not eating a sufficient amount of protein per meal to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. But this also has really disadvantageous effects during a diet. So, utilizing a high protein diet is something I'm a big believer in, as protein is the most satiating macronutrient. So, it helps us feel fuller for longer and manages hunger better than any other macronutrient. It has the highest thermic effect of feeding. So, if you have 100 calories from protein, the thermic effect is 20 to 30% with protein, whereas with carbs and fats, carbs is about 5 to 10%, and fats is about 0 to 3%. So every time you take in, say, 100 calories from protein, you might only absorb about 70 to 80 calories as compared to if you had 100 calories from fat, where you're absorbing 97 to 100 calories. So you're essentially burning a little bit more in the process of digestion, assimilation, metabolization of protein. And also, the process of undergoing muscle protein synthesis is very energy intensive. So this is going to help from muscle retention perspective. It's going to help from a thermic effective feeding perspective. But it's really going to, from a dieting perspective, it's really going to help from an appetite suppressing perspective. And when we look at it, like even if we go back evolutionarily, there's reasons as to why protein has always been the most satiating macronutrient. So there's something called the protein leverage hypothesis or protein leverage theory. And essentially what this theory suggests is that humans will eat until they eat enough protein or until they get enough protein in their diet. And only then will we feel satiated enough to stop eating. So we basically eat or don't stop eating until we reach our protein needs. And we also see in much of the literature that if you drop the protein percentage of the diet, it'll drastically increase the amount of calories that someone eats from both carbs and fats. So essentially what we're trying to do, we're trying to get protein from non-protein dominant food sources. So we'll continue to overeat until we meet our protein needs. But if we do the opposite, and there's many interventions that have done this, where the only thing that they modify in the diet is to increase protein intake. And we see that it causes a spontaneous decrease in calorie intake via reductions in hunger. So there's actually been some research where they've independently just taken groups and they've taken them from a 15% of calories from protein to 30% of calories from protein. And this was a study, I believe it's by Weigel in the early 2000s. And I know that what they found was that over a 12-week intervention, the average spontaneous reduction in calories was 441 calories per day. So essentially, these individuals put themselves in a deficit without the diet. Like when we talk about a dietary intervention, that doesn't mean a fat loss intervention in the research. What that means is they took them at baseline calories and all they did was modify the protein intake, and it led them into a spontaneous reduction in calories, which put them into a deficit. So think about when we really want to induce a deficit, we can utilize this as a lever to pull to help our clients get into a deficit much easier. And so really when it comes down to it, protein, from a macronutrient perspective, is the biggest lever that we can pull to, try to manage appetite and control our calorie intake. And even, I know you've had Eric Helms on the show before, and
Hmm.
I don't believe you guys spoke about nutrition, but if we look at the research that Eric actually did during his master's thesis, it was actually done at looking at the effects of using high protein during a deficit. So in one of his main studies, what Eric did was he compared a moderate protein diet, which was 1.6 grams per kilogram, versus a higher protein diet of 2.8 grams per kilogram per day. in resistance trained individuals. So these were athletes. These are people just like you and I that were really into resistance training. We want to improve our body composition. And specifically in this intervention study, they were looking to lose body fat. And what they found was that with the higher protein diet, they had greater diet satisfaction and satiation. So they felt greater feelings of fullness. And they also had lower levels of perceived stress, in these athletes that employed it. And they also reported lower fatigue levels. So these are just other, benefits of protein. We even see, like, if we look across, I often say success leaves clues. So if we look at research that's been done on bodybuilding case studies, there's actually a guy from your area, Dr. Andrew Chappelle, who's done a lot of
Yes.
research. Yeah, he's done a lot of observational research, which is incredible, on the successful habits of successful elite natural bodybuilders. And what he found was that one of the most commonly reported strategies in those competitors who got the leanest and maintained their muscle was they ate around 3.2 grams per kilogram of protein per day. So this is just like additional proof, or proof in the pudding, that higher protein intakes are really beneficial, especially during a deficit. And we see that
Hmm.
those who are the most successful, and believe me, I've trained many bodybuilders, and not everyone in the audience is a quote unquote bodybuilder or a competitive bodybuilder. But I would make the argument that if you are anyone out there and you're listening to this podcast and you tune into his podcast on a weekly basis, your goal is to increase muscle mass or maintain muscle mass and decrease body fat. You're looking to improve your body composition. So you are a bodybuilder. Even if you're a hobby builder, this can be a
Yeah.
hobby of yours. This doesn't have to be a competitive endeavor. But if you are someone that's serious about weight training, you're listening to educational podcasts on nutrition, you are a bodybuilder, even if you're not competitive. So we can look to some of the successful habits and strategies utilized by some of the most successful individuals in the world at doing what we're trying to do: get leaner and increase or maintain muscle mass, and try to employ some of them into your own dietary strategy. And then beyond protein, another thing that I really like to look at that a lot of people overlook is um, fiber, because fiber is extremely filling and is another aspect of the diet that I look to leverage, because a lot of people come to me, and I know at least in the States, we are highly um, deficient in fiber. We're very much under eating the amount of fiber that we should per day. So when we look at high fiber foods, they can increase fullness and reduce hunger, as high fiber foods, they generally provide a lot more food volume for a low amount of calories, which helps us feel fuller during the meal and then also after. And they also delay our gastric emptying rate. So we feel fuller for longer following the meals that, when we eat a meal that contains fiber. So really with my clients, one thing I specifically put, not everyone's a big fan of veggies. I am personally, fruits and vegetables, but I find a food source that works for them. But one thing I really like to employ with all of my diets is I specifically like to include one big ass salad in all of my fat loss diets, because salad packs a ton of satiety per calorie. So with every bite of that salad, you're going to feel fuller despite taking in a really low amount of calories. And salad also helps you slow down your rate of eating, which has also been associated with eating less. So when we have to go through the process of chewing at a slow rate and eating at a slower rate, it gives our body a lot more time to process those satiety signals so that they're able to reach the hypothalamus and really get that signal like, listen, I'm satiated. So that we're less likely to overeat. We're also more likely to feel fullness from the meals itself. And you guys can just do a comparative analysis. I like, researching on myself. So, there's research that actually looks at eating a meal over 24 minutes as compared to eating a meal after 6 minutes. And then what they'll do is they'll do a test meal after and see how many calories those two groups that utilize different eating rates ate at the subsequent meal. And we see a large reduction in calories. I believe it was in one study, the 24-minute group ate 25% less calories at that subsequent feeding as compared to the guys that rush through it. But you guys can do this in and of yourself. If you are someone that eats very consistently the same type of meals, every day at lunch you have, chicken and a sweet potato, try eating it really slowly as compared to the days that you rush or you're at work. Or I work with a lot of other coaches or PTs, and they're on the floor and they're rushing through it. And it's almost like they ate in such a mindless manner that it's almost like they didn't eat. They didn't even realize they ate anything. But when you slow things down, you allow yourself to be more mindful in the actual meal itself. You're not only going to feel greater satisfaction from that meal, you're going to be more connected, you're going to have better digestion. You're also going to be more aware from a psychological perspective. Yes, I've consumed calories. My body has really received this energy. And so that's one intervention. Some people, I can't get them to chew slower, but what I can do is implement an addition to their diet that makes them slow down. No one's eating a salad, scarfing it down, because it's so, you have to chew. There's so much to chew through. So that big ass salad really slows people down. It's something that I could utilize that goes beyond just telling someone chew slower or eat slower. It's really something that it actually gets them to do something. So I always say coaching is not just about educating people, it's also about showing them how to do it or putting in interventions or adjustments or changes within their program that makes them do it. You know what I mean? So through,
Hmm.
I'm able to intentionally get them to do something that maybe they wouldn't do if I just gave them the advice. Hey, listen, chew your food slower, or aim for 15 bites or 15 chews per bite. A lot of times they're not going to be counting that. But if I give them something that actually forces them to slow down, so I tell them, listen, instead of drinking apple juice with breakfast, I'm going to have you eat an apple. You know what I mean? Something like that.
Yeah.
We actually see in research studies that actually induces greater feelings of fullness. And then also from like the fiber perspective, you know, these are a lot of times, fiber sources that have a high amount of viscosity, meaning that they get like thick, like kind of like sludge, are really highly satiating due to the food volume and how slowly they digest. So one thing, food source that I like to utilize is that's fiber rich is oats because that's loaded with beta glucans, and it also has been shown to have one of the most highly satiating effects. So these are all things, all interventions, but that we can utilize to help induce greater feelings of fullness. These are nutrient dense food sources. So think about the highest fiber containing foods. We're talking potatoes that are highly satiating in and of themselves, fruits and vegetables, apples, berries. So what's great about these high fiber foods, they generally tend to be not only lower in energy density, so less calories per gram, but they also have a great micronutrient profile. So they're low in energy density but rich in nutrient density, and they provide a ton of volume, which makes them satiating. So these are really all interventions that can be utilized to make creating a deficit and maintaining a deficit much more easier and also more sustainable. And that's really what we want to do. Because I always say, like, oftentimes I'll be asked by clients or I'll be on a podcast, someone will ask me about, how about utilizing if it fits your macros? And I think if it fits your macros from a fundamental perspective is great. You're able to have flexibility, you're able to swap out foods. But as we get deeper and deeper into the deficit, you're suffering already from dietary fatigue. Then you're having the mental fatigue, the decision fatigue aspect of it. And if you're trying to play macro Tetris and fit things in and make all these festive meals that are only driving your appetite and your hunger and leaving you less satiated, you're going to be more likely to overeat. So really what I'm trying to do is provide my clients with the most satiety per calorie, really helping them manage all these physiological and psychological side effects of dieting to the best of our ability.
Fantastic. So, just to recap for the audience, you've just been sharing so much incredible knowledge. I think this will be everybody's one-stop shop to learn how to manage their diet and create a diet that helps them um, achieve their fat loss goals while suffering the least. You use the term suffering, so I'll go with that. But just to recap, your high priority principles as it pertains to the food is, well, first of all, a food first approach where you create a calorie deficit, but not a nutrient deficit. And then your second high priority principle is energy density, maximizing that to maximize satiety. Then we have protein, and finally fiber. So these, is my understanding, are the tools you use in terms of changing someone's diet. What do you do in terms of, if you do anything, when it comes to the energy out aspect of the equation?
Yeah, so absolutely. So there's many interventions that we can utilize to manipulate energy expenditure or the energy out perspective. But really, I try to look at the low-hanging fruit first and foremost. So although a lot of people will focus on cardio, and I think cardio is a great modality, what I really try to do, especially when someone is newer to dieting or has had previous bad experiences, what I really have a lot of people come to me is I have one of two extremes. I have someone that's the chronic dieter and that has went through so many consecutive fat loss phases, has had all of these cycles of weight loss and weight regain, and they've had a lot of negative experiences throughout the process. And really what that comes down to is an approach that was not only unsustainable, but it induced more suffering. So these are individuals that over restricted their calories, they overdid the hit cardio, the high intensity forms of cardio, the boot camp classes, and so they did so many things that caused negative down regulations in their total daily energy expenditure as well as their hormonal profiles, that they ended up suffering a lot of repercussions after. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, I have a lot of newer dieters that come to me, or people that want to do their first true fat loss phase or their first two true contest prep. And so really what I'm trying to do is really, I always say there's a balance between optimality and practicality. And what I try to do is meet in the middle, and it's more of a moderate approach. So really what I like to utilize is I like to or I tend to start clients out by having them track their steps. which I
Mhm.
use as a way to quantify their physical activity levels and keep their NEAT levels higher. So NEAT is their non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And the real reason I do that, yes, it's going to drive energy expenditure. So if you do more steps, you're going to increase the amount of calories you burn per day. But it's a dual aspect as to why I utilize this. And this is something that a lot of people overlook or don't highlight enough. But the thing is, a lot of people don't realize that non-exercise activity thermogenesis, aka NEAT, accounts for up to 85 to 90% of the reductions in the amount of calories we burn per day that come as a result of the metabolic adaptations that are induced by being in an energy deficit. So when we go into a calorie deficit, as we eat less, we burn less. But one of the biggest aspects or the biggest areas in which we see down regulations is from that non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So it's not enough to just do cardio, because if you're doing, say, 30 minutes of cardio per day and it's formalized, but then you're sitting more, you're slouching more, and you're subconsciously, remember, this is not stuff that we're purposely trying to do. But if you're not tracking the rest of your physical activity levels, you may be undoing or compensating for that cardio you're doing, and essentially negating the deficit that you created or the amount of calories you burn through that cardio session. So I utilize steps as both a way to increase energy expenditure, to offset the net or the adaptations in down regulations in NEAT, and then also to use as an awareness tool for my clients. So if we really look into literature, and the reason I highlight this is because there is such a lack of awareness around this. But for instance, there's a study, and it's one of my favorite studies. It's that really got me into this years ago, and why I started. This is experiences that I had myself. So I noticed that during contest preps of my own, every prep, it seemed like I was working more and more of a sedentary job. As an online coach, you're seated most of the day. And so when I had an active job on or active career on the floor as a personal trainer, my NEAT level stayed higher. And at the time, this is 2011, 2012. I didn't have a Fitbit. I don't even think those were around at the time, but I had never tracked steps. But throughout the course of the day, it didn't matter if I was in an energy deficit or if I was dieting or not. I had to stay active. It was part of my job. Well, as years went on, and I transitioned into a more sedentary role, which is what many of us do. Many people listening to the podcast, they're in front of their computer all day, just like you and I. So we have to be more aware of this. But a lot of times during a diet, we overcompensate, meaning we actually reduce our non-exercise activity levels much greater than we even imagined. We're fidgeting less, we're blinking less. These are things we're never going to notice, nor are we going to be able to track. However, one way we can track some of our NEAT is through steps, which is actually makes up the greatest component of our non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So, I started noticing that every prep I was having to do more and more formal cardio. And at one point, I was competing at the national level in the US, and I was up to 2 hours of cardio a day, an hour in the morning, an hour at night. And I'm saying, I don't understand this. I used to get lean and not have to do this. Well, what I didn't factor in was that hours throughout the day I was standing, I was loading plates, I was walking around the gym, I was interacting with clients, but I was highly active. So when I took that stimulus out, or that energy expenditure aspect out, it drastically reduced my NEAT levels, especially when I went into a deficit. And now I was seating more than I ever did. And so there's a study by Rosenbaum where they looked at how much of a reduction in total daily energy expenditure dieters who had lost at least 10% of their body weight sustained. And so what they saw was a 500-calorie reduction in the amount of calories they were burning per day, which is a fairly large reduction. So say you go into a 500-calorie deficit, you lose 10% of your body weight. If you were in this group, you would have essentially negated the deficit. You would have been at maintenance just due to the reductions in total daily energy expenditure. But then what they did was, and this was the first study that had done this, was they analyzed and broke down the various aspects of the metabolic adaptation. And they broke it down into multiple components to see what specific aspects of the dieter's total daily energy expenditure were impacted the most from that weight loss. So they didn't want to just see a total, because then a lot of people would look to it as, oh, my metabolism downregulated 500 calories. So they took and they measured in the lab, and they had them in a metabolic chamber, and they looked at every component of their total daily energy expenditure. And what they found was that those who had lost 10% of their body weight only saw around a 100-calorie reduction in their resting metabolic rate. So out of the 500 calories that they had reduced per day in terms of how many they were burning, metabolic rate only accounted for a small component of that. So it wasn't like they drastically had their metabolic rate cut in half or something. They saw a small reduction. It was accounted for about 20%. However, when they analyzed the rest of the components that contributed to this large degree of metabolic adaptation, they found that their calories burned through NEAT had decreased by around 400 calories per day. So 80% of the calorie decreases that they had seen in terms of the amount that they were burning per day came from NEAT. And we do see in the vast majority of research on fat loss that when we go into an energy deficit and lose a substantial amount of weight, 85 to 90% of, or 90, yeah, 85 to 90% of the reductions that we see in energy expenditure comes specifically from down regulations in need. Because during fat loss phases and, dieting in general, it causes us to down regulate a lot of our physical processes. But if you're a resistance training individual, you're going to still go to the gym. And if you're doing cardio, you may keep that, baseline and consistent. However, the rest of the day, you're sitting more, you're slouching more, even you're compensating more, you're doing things that you're not even aware of. So that's where, really when it comes down to it, monitoring NEAT levels is really beneficial. And so we even see in other aspects of literature that when it comes to losing body fat, high levels of physical activity help to not only make up for the reductions in energy expenditure that come from these down regulations in NEAT, but we also see that those who maintain higher levels of physical activity have lower body fat percentages. And they also have better appetite regulation because having higher levels of activity makes us more sensitive to satiety signals. So we can more easily manage hunger and regulate our energy intake because we're more in tune with our hunger cues. And this is why I'm really a little bit more preferential or biased towards steps and lower intensity cardio than higher intensity cardio. Because really, when we look at the broad, basis of exercise interventions and appetite, we actually see that a lot of people have this misconception that exercise automatically drives hunger. Really, we don't see that. It's either neutral or it causes an appetite suppressing effect. But there are certain individuals that get in this mindset that they go into a HIIT class or they do a HIIT session and they see the amount of calories they burned on this monitor in their gym, and that they're going to eat back these calories, and they feel like this subconscious or this psychological increase in hunger. And we have to realize we cannot detach psychology from physiology. So although your levels of ghrelin might not be going up due to that high intensity exercise, if you feel hungry, you're more likely to overeat. So if we do something low intensity, like going for post-meal walks, which helps with blood sugar regulation, it's going to help increase the amount of calories you burn per day. It's going to help with nutrient partitioning. These are all things that they're habit stacking, and they also make sure that it's a lot more sustainable for an individual. So really when it comes down to it, if I have a client and they have to do an hour cardio like I did in the morning and then an hour at night, how long are they going to do that for? That might be a few days per week, but something comes up. I work with many parents. Something comes up that their kid's school gets delayed, or they need to go to an activity after school to bring, go watch their kid's soccer game. The first thing they're going to cut out is that formal cardio. But if I tell them, listen, I want you to aim for 10 to 11,000 steps per day in any modality you want, make sure to get a morning walk because I want you to get some sunlight and some, sun exposure. However, any other time throughout the day, go for a 10-minute walk or a 20-minute walk, or make it fit your schedule as long as you hit that total by the end of the day. Or if we do it by a weekly amount. So I might tell a client, listen, I want 70,000 steps across the course of the week. So really that equates to 10,000 steps per day. But say you go 9,000 one day, go 11,000 the next day. And so it's just like managing your calorie budget. However, it's managing your step budget and makes it much more feasible and realistic for clients who have busy lives and who want to stay consistent, but they might have so many things that come up throughout the course of their lifestyle or their day that they need to be a lot more flexible with their approach. And that's really what coaching comes down to. It's not about, listen, every client has to do an hour of fasted cardio immediately upon waking after taking this and this supplement. It's really about modifying the approach you take towards the individual and really meeting them where they're at.
Absolutely. Thank you for that explanation. And actually, you and the listeners will have noticed that I've not really been saying anything throughout this podcast, mainly because, well, the listeners can't see me, but I've been just nodding along because I feel like you're in my head. Your high priority principles for fat loss are exactly the same that I apply with all of my clients. So we're on the same boat here. You explained every concept beautifully. So thank you for that, Brandon.
Absolutely.
And I think the listeners will take a lot from this podcast. My clients will probably have been listening, nodding along as well, thinking, oh yeah, Coach Nick always says, do your steps or whatever. And there's a reason for that.
Reinforcement right here.
Exactly. So thank you very much for being on the podcast twice. Just like
Absolutely.
last time, I will have in the show notes a link to your Facebook, to your Instagram accounts, your email address as well, and a link to your website. Is there anything other than that that you'd like to plug for the audience before we let them go on with their day?
Yeah, just one last thing. I don't know how many of your listeners are in the States or anyone that travels out. However, I am going to be putting on what's called a Physique Education Collective. And that is a seminar series that I speak at with many of the brightest minds and researchers in this industry. So, for instance, I will be speaking on optimizing insulin sensitivity to optimize body composition and health outcomes. So that'll be my topic. But we also have Alan Aragon speaking, Dr. Scott Stevenson. We've had Dr. Bill Campbell on the seminar presentation before. We have Lauren Conlon. So we have many researchers, many practitioners, many coaches, and this will be an event that's going to take place in Tampa the weekend of January 27th and 28th. Tampa, Florida is beautiful, especially in January where it's mostly cold in the US, but it's a beautiful area, which is nice and warm. So anyone that's out there that's interested in not only getting, really leveling up their education, but meeting some of the brightest minds in the industry that really like interacting with people. This is something that I've been making presentations around the country for the past 10 years. And unfortunately, during the pandemic, it was one period of my life where I wasn't traveling. And it's something I truly miss because I really do like, as much as I love podcasting, and it's actually the pandemic that really got me into podcasting because a lot of the interactions or a lot of the presentations that I used to do were in person. I never jumped on podcasts
Oh,
until,
wow.
yeah, until the pandemic. So it was really that spurred me on that I had a lot of invites, but I used to travel so much for work and I was constantly making presentations that I didn't jump on the opportunities to get on podcasts. And when we got shut down, like the first week, a bunch of people had, emailed me and said, listen, now that I know you can't be traveling because you're stuck in New York, what do you think about now coming on my podcast? Which I, openly, and graciously accepted the invite. And at this point, we're 2 years in and I've averaged, I think about 2 podcasts per week the last 2 years. So I've been at a pretty good clip. But for anyone that is into in-person, seminars and things of that sort, they really want to level up not only their education, but their network. And that's a big thing. This industry, especially, and Nicholas could probably attest to this, coaching can kind of be a lonely road because it is really focused on your own clientele, your own business. However, it's always nice to be able to interact and link up and create relationships and friendships with like-minded individuals. And that's why I love doing podcasts. So, if you ever want to have me back on again, I'd be more than happy to come back on and cover anything you need. And I think we actually have a couple more topics that we need to hit on. I know that you had a couple more questions, so we could always do a part 3. But really, these in-person, seminars provide us with an opportunity to meet like-minded individuals, and that's really what this industry is about: driving this industry forward and setting a greater standard for what we do as a profession.
That's a great event. Is there a website where somebody can get tickets?
Yeah, absolutely. So you guys can find tickets at theexcellencecartel.com.
theexcellencecartel.com.
Yes, sir.
Perfect. So I can put that in the show notes as well for anyone who's interested. And I think that's it for today's podcast. Thank you very much, Brandon. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And I'll talk to you next time.
Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you found this interview valuable. As usual, if you want to connect with me or with Brandon, you'll find all of the links to do so in the show notes. Thank you again for listening, and until next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.